Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Resolution Room. I'm your host, Robert M. Holmes, HR strategist, coach, and the new author of Human Resources for the Soul, Managing the Human in You. In that book, I explore how we can become effective managers of our own inner employee. I blend HR savvy with behavioral health wisdom and a little bit of humor. We talk about setting healthy boundaries, resolving conflicts with empathy, prioritizing wellness, and practicing self-leadership in our daily lives. It's all about managing the human in you, treating your inner self with the same care and sometimes tough love that a good HR manager will give an employee. And if you ever manage people, or even just try to manage yourself, you know that's no small task. In today's episode is going to tie directly into those themes. We're going to talk about weaponized wellness, how the language of HR and mental health can be twisted into a shield to dodge responsibility. It's a mouthful, but think of phrases you've probably heard, or maybe even used. I have to protect my peace. This is a toxic workplace. I'm so burnt out. In theory, these statements relate to very valid concepts: setting boundaries, calling out harmful environments, preventing burnout. These are all things I champion in my book and in my coaching. But in practice, what happens when those phrases are thrown around too easily or insincerely? When protecting my peace becomes an excuse to avoid an uncomfortable but necessary conversation? Or when labeling a coworker toxic is a way to deflect from one's own behavior? That's what we're unpacking today. I'll start with a quick personal story to set the stage. A few years back, during a corporate workshop on conflict resolution, an attendee came up to me during a break. Let's call her Jane. Jane said, "Rob, I love all this touchy-feely wellness stuff, but sometimes I feel like people use it to get away with murder in the office." Figuratively, of course. I asked what she meant, and she gave an example. Her team had a member who chronically missed deadlines. When confronted, he replied with things like, "I'm feeling really burned out. I need to protect my peace," and then accused the team of creating a toxic environment. Whenever anyone pressed him on his deliverables, the team was left walking on eggshells, afraid that holding him accountable would make them sound unsupportive or insensitive. Sound familiar? Jane's story stuck with me because it highlighted a tricky balance. How do we promote wellness and empathy at work without letting the lingo wellness become a free pass to evade accountability? So, in the spirit of the resolution room, let's dive into this balancing act. We'll explore how good concepts can go wrong, how boundaries can blur into avoidance, how advocating mental health can morph into sidestepping responsibilities, and how HR terminology like toxic workplace can be misapplied. We'll look at real workplace stories of these dynamics in action, hear insights from experts in HR and psychology, and talk strategies for leaders and HR pros to handle these situations with both compassion and no-nonsense clarity. By the end of this podcast training session, I hope you have a smile on your face, a couple of aha moments, and some practical tips for managing the human beings, including the one inside of you, a little better. Grab a coffee, find a comfy seat, and let's get into it. When wellness language becomes a shield. Let's start with the big picture. The rise of therapy and wellness language in everyday work life. Over the last few years, concepts from therapy and mental health have burst out of clinicians' office and into pop culture. Suddenly, everyone and their cousin is talking about setting boundaries, triggering behavior, safe spaces, and self-care Sundays. In many ways, this is fantastic. It shows we're finally breaking the taboo around mental health and encouraging people to speak up about their well-being. As an HR guy and a coach, I love that we're normalizing phrases like mental health day or psychological safety. Our parents, our grandparents certainly didn't feel that they could tell their boss, "I'm feeling burned out and need a break." Today, more of us do, and that's progress. But you knew a but was coming. With this new vocabulary entering the workplace, there's also been a misuse or misinterpretation of it. Pop psychology terms can get overused or stretched beyond their intent. We see non-clinical folks slinging around serious labels: narcissist, toxic, trauma response, and casual conversation. In meetings or team chats, people sometimes deploy these terms not to really address issues, but to shut down discussion or avoid discomfort. It's what some counselors call therapy speak. Essentially, bits of therapeutic jargon are used outside of their proper context, often inaccurately, and they can end up as conversation stoppers. Why does this happen? One reason is that therapy speak and wellness lingo can act as a social shield. When someone says, I need to set a boundary or this environment is toxic, those around them might hesitate to question it. After all, who wants to challenge someone's personal boundary or tell them their feelings are invalid? As one counseling center blog noted, there may be an understanding that therapy speak can't be questioned. It carries a whiff of clinical authority, so people tend to back off. In a way, invoking these concepts can give the speaker the moral high ground, intentionally or not. It can cut off further inquiry. End of discussion. I've announced I'm protecting my mental health. Case closed. Now, let's be clear. Often, people use this language earnestly and appropriately. Boundaries are healthy. Workplaces can be toxic. Burnout is real. Believe me, I've been there. We'll talk soon about how to support these genuine cases. What we're focusing on here is the more cynical use, what I'm calling weaponized wellness. That's when someone leverages well-intentioned ideas like self-care or psychological safety, not for healing or openness, but as a tactical move in a conflict or to dodge legitimate accountability. It's like using a wellness buzzword as a get-out-of-jail-free card, or maybe a get-out-of-meeting-free card. Think of it this way. HR policies and mental health initiatives are meant to help employees, to ensure people feel safe, supported, and balanced. However, some executives have quietly voiced a concern. What if employees take advantage of these supports or words to slack off or avoid criticism? In fact, an HR expert, Michael Davis, noted that some leaders fear mental health efforts will be weaponized, used as an excuse for poor performance or excessive absences. For example, a CEO might worry that if they encourage taking mental health days, a few folks might start calling out sick with dubious claims, whenever the going gets tough. Or a manager might find that any tough feedback they give is branded as not supporting my wellness. These fears aren't coming from nowhere. There have been cases and anecdotes fueling them. However, we should balance this perspective with data. Davis points out that research doesn't actually show rampant abuse of mental health accommodations. In reality, many employees are still hesitant to speak up about their mental health at all. Less than 35% feel comfortable talking about it at work, which suggests stigma and underutilization are bigger problems than overuse. So, while weaponized wellness is real, we have to remember it's not everyone doing it. And the answer isn't to roll back support. Instead, the answer is discernment and good management, which we'll get into with strategies later on. So with that backdrop, let's zero in on a few specific phrases and scenarios. I like to call them the big three of potential wellness misuse at work. Boundaries, protecting my peace, toxicity, this place is toxic, and burnout, I'm burnt out. Each of these has a legitimate side and a less legitimate side. Let's analyze them one by one with some real talk about how they show up in our workplaces. Protecting my peace versus owning my actions, the boundaries question. Boundaries. The B word that's become ubiquitous in self-help books and Instagram posts. Don't get me wrong, I'm a huge fan of healthy boundaries. We all need limits to preserve our mental health and ensure work doesn't trample our life. In Human Resources for the Soul, I even talk about establishing business hours for your inner employee, basically teaching the workaholic within you to take a seat and let you rest. Boundaries, in the true sense, are about understanding what's your responsibility and what isn't, and communicating that clearly and kindly. But what happens when I'm setting a boundary turns into a blanket excuse for dodging any unpleasant task or feedback? Lately, HR professionals have reported a trend of employees invoking boundaries in questionable ways. For instance, consider an employee who misses a deadline, and when their manager asks about it, they respond, I have to protect my peace. The pressure was too much. Or someone who habitually arrives late, and when challenged says, my boundaries don't allow work emails before 10 a.m., despite their 9 a.m. start time. These might be a little extreme, but they illustrate the point. The concept of boundaries can be distorted into a shield against accountability. One expert on this topic, Cheryl Green, wrote an article pointedly titled, Boundaries Aren't an Excuse: Why Setting Limits Doesn't Mean Dodging Responsibility. In it, she observes that all too often, people use the term boundaries as a way to deflect blame, evade responsibility, and dodge accountability for their actions. Ouch. That's a no BS way to put it. She notes hearing folks say things like, I'm protecting my peace, yet completely ignoring the trail of emotional carnage they leave behind for others. In plainer terms, someone might unilaterally declare a boundary to avoid owning up to a mistake, without regard for the inconvenience or hurt it causes colleagues. It's the workplace equivalent of, I'm not talking to you anymore because boundaries, even if you are the one who was harmed by their miscommitment. Healthy boundaries are not about avoiding duties. They're about clarifying roles and preserving well-being while still honoring your obligations. As Greens puts it, if you agree to do something, you've got to do it. You don't get to throw your hands up after the fact and yell, I've got boundaries, as an escape hatch. True boundary setting happens before you take something on, not the moment you realize you've dropped the ball. For example, a healthy boundary might be telling your boss in advance, I cannot stay past 6 p.m. due to family commitments, which allows planning and negotiation. In contrast, disappearing at 4 p.m. on a critical deadline day and later saying, well, I have boundaries, is not in the spirit of professional or personal responsibility. Interesting, many health professionals themselves have started to critique this trend. A counseling-centered blog noted that terms like boundaries and self-care, while vital, are frequently misapplied to avoid accountability or shift responsibility. The blog gave a vivid example, justifying hurtful behavior by saying, I'm protecting my boundaries. Sound familiar? It's like snapping at a coworker or ghosting a friend and later claiming it was an act of self-care. As that blog put it, a lot of these therapeutic phrases are now used when people simply don't want to do something. The phrase boundaries in particular has become galling to therapists because they see it being thrown around to rationalize selfish or avoidant choices. Let's bring it to life with a short workplace story. We'll call this one the case of the boundary bandit. A mid-level manager, Alex, was notorious for invoking boundaries in every situation. If Alex was asked to attend a last-minute important meeting, no, I have to set a boundary to protect my time. If Alex received constructive criticism on a project, I'm going to set a boundary and not engage with negative energy. Alex even started declining to collaborate with a certain colleague, citing, I need to protect my peace around them, leaving the team baffled because no one was aware of any real issue between the two. Eventually, it emerged that the colleague had simply given Alex some technical feedback Alex didn't want to hear. And Alex's boundary was basically giving that person the silent treatment. The result? Miscommunications, duplicated work, and growing resentment on both sides. HR was eventually pulled in to mediate. In the conversation, the HR partner gently told Alex, setting boundaries isn't about avoiding everyone who upsets you or every duty that's uncomfortable. It's about managing your reactions and workload proactively. Alex was encouraged to articulate what they really needed, which turned out to be more lead time for meetings, fair, and a calmer way for colleagues to get feedback, also fair. HR helped Alex and the team agree on some communication norms, but they also made it clear to Alex that boundary can't be code for opting out of core job functions or relationships. In other words, your boundary can't be, I don't take assignments from my boss, unless you also want to set a boundary with employment. The lesson from the boundary bandit is that invoking wellness concepts doesn't automatically put you in the right. We have to ask, is this a real boundary protecting a legitimate need or an excuse wrapped in virtuous language? A good self-test is the aftermath. If your boundary leaves a string of unmet obligation or harms others, it's worth reevaluating. Boundaries and responsibilities should work together, not against each other. Ideally, your boundaries help you be more effective and respectful in the commitments you do choose to make. To all the Alexes out there, and we've all been Alex at some point, by all means, protect your peace. But if you made a promise or are part of a team, remember that honoring your word is part of protecting your peace too. It protects your integrity and relationships. In the end, no more excuses, as a sticky note in Cheryl's article cover said. Boundaries are about drawing lines. Yes, but not about crossing lines with others or dropping the ball without consequence. Next up is the T word, toxic. If there's one word that has exploded in workplace discourse and beyond in recent years, is this one. Toxic boss, toxic team, toxic culture. It's become a go-to label for all manner of negative situations. Sometimes it's dead on accurate. There are toxic workplaces out there, rife with harassment, bullying, dysfunction, you name it. Those should absolutely be called out. No one should endure truly toxic conditions. Other times, however, I've seen toxic used more loosely, almost as a synonym for imperfect or I had a bad day. One therapist remarked that toxic is easily overused. It's a way of reframing a difficult relationship as one not worth having. In her counseling sessions, rather than latch onto the adjective toxic, she asks clients to describe the specific behaviors or issues at play. That's good advice for us at work, too. If we shout toxic at every conflict or challenge, we might be short circuiting any chance to actually address the problem. It becomes a conversation ender. This place is toxic, full stop. Where do you go from there? Often straight to LinkedIn to update your resume, because if something is truly toxic, the implicit solution is to leave or cut it out of your life. Let's consider how labeling something toxic can sometimes be a form of avoiding complexity or responsibility. Have you ever been given tough feedback to an employee and they responded not by addressing the substance of the feedback, but by saying, "This feels like a toxic work environment now"? I have. It's tricky because once that word is dropped, everyone gets tense. No one wants to be associated with toxicity. I've had managers ask, "Am I being toxic for holding my team accountable?" There's genuine confusion because the line between strict and toxic can feel blurry when emotions run high. Here's where I channel one of my favorite leadership coaches, Chris Platchy. She delivered a strong dose of reality on this. Being held accountable to a goal that you knew about is not creating a toxic work environment. In other words, if your boss or team lead is asking you to deliver the results you agreed to, and maybe even putting you on a performance plan if you consistently don't, that's not being toxic. That's normal accountability in a functioning workplace. As Platchy notes, we've gotten to a point where simply saying, "Hey, you were supposed to do X by Tuesday and it didn't happen," is perceived by some as a personal attack or a sign of a blame oriented culture. It absolutely shouldn't be. Feedback or consequences for unmet expectations, given professionally, are part and parcel of work life. Mislabeling that as abuse does a disservice to everyone. It trivializes real toxicity, and it prevents the underperformer from growing. One sign of a misused toxic claim is when it's deployed suddenly in the face of criticism. A high-performing employee who's been happy for years likely won't suddenly scream toxic because they got one piece of tough feedback. They have goodwill in the bank and perspective. Is more often a pattern with someone who, say, has been cautioned multiple times. And at the point of serious consequences, they declare the whole environment toxic, sometimes in a very public way, like a scathing all hands email with everyone copied or a Glassdoor review. It's a deflection, a way to flip the script so that they're no longer the one on the hot seat. Now you, the manager, or the company are. Certainly, there are cases where an environment really was bad, and the person finally speaks up only when leaving. But I'm focusing on a scenario where toxicity is used to avoid personal accountability. Let's bring in another perspective. Juliet Kateri, a psychologist and recruiter, posed an insightful question. Are we overusing the word toxic to describe simply having a rough day? Or are we truly identifying environments that are detrimental to our well-being? She reminds us that a genuine toxic workplace is more than just occasional stress. It's a constant poison, a place of sustained dysfunction where negativity is the norm and growth is impossible. She even shares her own story of a clearly toxic situation where feedback was silenced, broken promises were the norm, and bullying was rife. That's earned the label toxic. But Kateri's key point was the importance of differentiating a toxic culture from just a bad day or a normal setback. If you had one disagreement with a coworker this week, that's not automatically a toxic workplace. If your boss gave you constructive criticism, that's not inherently toxic leadership. In fact, one red flag of a toxic person, not environment, can be overusing the victim stance whenever confronted. Dr. Rashad Ritchie phrased it well in a social media post. Truly toxic individuals often flip to forever victim mode when being held accountable, using manipulation to avoid blame. They might cry foul, claim they are being bullied, or say their character is under attack, just because someone pointed out a policy violation or a poor result. If every instance of being challenged is met with "this place is toxic," chances are the toxicity isn't coming from all around that person. It's radiating from that person, or at least the word is being weaponized to freeze others in their tracks. Consider a quick case study. The boy who cried toxic. A tech company hired a developer, let's call him Dev, who was very skilled, but had a habit of lashing out at code review feedback. When peers would critique his code, which is a normal process in software teams, Dev would get defensive and occasionally drop comments like, "This culture is feeling toxic. People aren't being supportive." Team members grew confused and cautious, second guessing their perfectly reasonable feedback. Was it toxic to point out a bug? Meanwhile, Dev's own tone in code reviews, when he reviewed others, would be harsh. When someone called him on that, guess what term he used? Yep, toxic. Eventually, HR and management had to step in. They gathered concrete examples of what Dev called toxic behavior. In reviewing them, it was clear that in most cases, colleagues had been factual and polite. It was the situation that Dev didn't like, being critiqued. To his credit, once this was carefully laid out, Dev had an epiphany that he was using the label way too loosely. He was feeling anxiety about being criticized and interpreting his discomfort as these people are toxic, rather than recognizing it as a normal learning pain. With coaching, Dev got better at handling feedback without resorting to name calling. And the team, for its part, got a refresher on giving feedback with empathy, just in case there was any toxicity creeping in. The moral of the story is not that toxic workplaces don't exist. They do. And we should never minimize true systemic workplace toxicity. It's that we should attach the label carefully. If everything that makes us uncomfortable gets stamped toxic in big red letters, we lose the ability to distinguish between a workplace that's truly abusive versus one that's perhaps demanding but fair, or occasionally flawed but basically healthy. As a seasoned HR professional, my advice is describe before you prescribe. If you feel an environment is toxic, document specific incidents, behaviors, and patterns. If you're just slapping a word on a general feeling or dissatisfaction, be cautious. You might be avoiding a narrow, solvable issue within your control. To those who feel tempted to use toxic in the heat of the moment, I say, pause and ask, what exactly am I reacting to? Is it that you were treated with disrespect, or simply that you were held to a standard? One quote I love, please, let's learn to differentiate between a toxic workplace and just having a bad day. That perspective keeps us honest. It encourages us to sob the bad days and flee the truly toxic ones. And it also encourages taking accountability for our part. As another source mentioned, everyone in the workplace contributes in some way to the culture, even if just by staying silent. If something is toxic, by all means, speak up or leave. If it's not, then do your part to improve it. Now, let's talk about burnout. One of the three concepts we're dissecting, burnout is perhaps the most personally visceral. Who among us hasn't felt that bone-deep exhaustion, the dread of work, the foggy brain, at least at some point in our career? Burnout is very real and can be devastating to both employees and organizations. In fact, burnout has been recognized by the World Health Organization as a legitimate occupational phenomenon, characterized by exhaustion, cynicism, and reduced efficiency. When someone says, I'm burnt out, and truly means it, they deserve support, recovery time, maybe a workload adjustment, and perhaps a broader organizational look at why burnout happened. However, and you knew there'd be a however, burnout can also be claimed in bad faith or misdiagnosed. It's become a bit of a buzzword, just like our other terms. A few decades ago, people might simply say, I'm tired, or I need a vacation. Now it's, I'm burnt out. One workplace commentary cynically noted that burnout has turned into a badge of honor for some. Basically, a way of saying, I'm so indispensable and dedicated that I worked myself into dysfunction. That author admitted he sometimes hears burnout and thinks it's a possible excuse for lowering performance, even dubbing it cop out instead of burnout in those cases. That might be a little harsh. I can almost hear the collective groan of mental health advocates, but he's reflecting a real sentiment out there among some managers. Now, I don't endorse dismissing burnout as laziness, far from it, but I do think we have to differentiate between true burnout and what you might call situational overload or even disengagement. True burnout usually comes from prolonged stress and often a mismatch between effort and the reward. It's not solved by a single good night's sleep or a long weekend. If someone is truly burned out, they might need weeks or even months of recovery and systemic fixes to their workload or environment. On the other hand, I've encountered employees who declare burnout after a couple of hectic weeks, or conveniently right when new projects are assigned, or when their performance is under scrutiny. It's possible they are beginning to burn out, sure, but it's also possible that burnout becomes a convenient narrative to mask other issues like procrastination, lack of interest in the role, or even performance problems. One story from a past client: a team was gearing up for a big product launch, a real crunch time. One member, we'll call him Sam, had been underperforming for a while, missed deliverables, frequent absences, and his manager was on the verge of putting him on an improvement plan. Right as that discussion was about to happen, Sam sent an email to the team saying that he was experiencing severe burnout and needed to take a step back. Naturally, everyone was concerned. The company encouraged using mental health leave if needed. HR got involved to ensure Sam got support. But here's where things took a twist. While on his self-declared step back, Sam was posting Instagram photos of himself, surfing daily, and commenting that he was loving life, finally free of the grind. Now, there's nothing wrong with enjoying time off the hill. In fact, that's great. But Sam never followed up with any HR support services, never saw a counselor or doctor about stress, and didn't respond when HR tried to check on how we could accommodate a return. After a few weeks, he just resigned and privately told a coworker he had actually been planning to quit for a while because he disliked the job, but figured claiming burnout would look better than admitting he was checked out. This is an extreme example, and frankly, an unwise move on his part, as references might reflect that. But it shows the potential for misuse. Burnout in his case was used as a shield against the consequences of poor performance and a way to exit more on his terms. The perception of burnout as an excuse has even reached the pages of Forbes. One contributor controversially wrote, "Burnout equals excuses. It equals laziness, and it's disguised as exhaustion from working hard enough." I think that's an overstatement. Labeling everyone who claims burnout as lazy is unfair and unempathetic. Many people who say they're burned out truly are, and didn't get support early enough. Yet that Forbes quote is jarring because it reflects a frustration some business leaders have, perhaps from encounters with people who cried burnout without basis. It's a backlash that, if it grows, could be dangerous. It could discourage legitimate cries for help. So we in HR need to take and tackle this very carefully. Validate real burnout, but also address potential misuse in a way that doesn't stigmatize the concept. One helpful approach is education. Some employees may say I'm burned out when they are really just tired or temporarily overloaded. They might not know the difference. It's not like we get a user manual on how to label our feelings. By educating teams on what burnout truly entails, for example, persistent exhaustion, cynicism, declining performance, even physical symptoms, we can help people self-assess more accurately. I've had conversations where an employee says, "I think I'm burning out," and we discuss their symptoms and situation. Sometimes it's classic burnout, and we have to take that seriously. Other times, as we talk, it turns out they recently had a rough patch outside of work, say a recent move or a life change or a sick pet, simply 2 weeks of poor sleep, and now they feel depleted. In those cases, a bit of rest and temporary support may do the trick. I encourage them not to label themselves burnt out prematurely, but rather to see it as I'm really drained right now, and here's what would help. In a sense, that's hitting off a budding issue before it becomes chronic burnout. From a responsibility standpoint, we all have to own our role in burnout too. That's tough because burnout often feels like something that happens to us. But as the saying goes, we teach people how to treat us. If you never say no, never set limits, there's that word again, and take on unrealistic loads, you might inadvertently contribute to your own burnout. That doesn't make it your fault, but it means you have some agency in preventing or mitigating it. I've been on both sides. I've burned out before, and in hindsight, I saw red flags where I could have asked for help or pushed back, but I didn't, either out of pride or fear. Now, I coach others to recognize those flags in themselves. Conversely, organizations absolutely have a responsibility to not overload people chronically and to staff properly. When I consult with companies, I tell leaders, if you're seeing multiple cases of burnout, that's not a series of individual failures. That's a systemic issue you need to address. One more angle. Burnout is sometimes claimed to cover up other issues, like bore out, being chronically understimulated, or a mismatch of career passion. An employee might say, "I'm burned out because it's more culturally acceptable, then I find this work meaningless and I'm unmotivated. In terms of accountability, it might be easier to claim a quasi-medical condition than to admit to lack of effort or interest. As HR, we should create an environment where people can be honest about these things too, so that burnout doesn't become a catch-all scapegoat for any kind of disengagement. Let me highlight an expert quote to underline that burnout is not just a flimsy excuse. In the HR Journal, writer Miriam Groom emphasized, burnout isn't just an excuse people use to get out of work. It's a real occupational phenomenon recognized by the World Health Organization. The term may be trendy, but that doesn't strip it of validity. So, while we should be wary of it being misdeclared, we must remain compassionate and thorough whenever someone brings it up. The worst outcome would be swinging the pendulum back to a culture of burnout is BS, tough it out. That helps no one and ultimately destroys morale and retention. We have to find the nuance. Burnout can be real and sometimes misused. Our job is to tell the difference. Let's shift gears and delve into a few real-life workplace stories that illustrate this phenomenon of weaponized wellness. Names changed to protect privacy, of course. These are cases I've encountered as a consultant or as an HR manager, or heard from other HR peers. As you listen, notice the patterns and think about how you might handle these situations. Number 1, the toxic turnaround. A small startup hired a new sales director, we'll call her Maria, who came highly recommended. Maria was charismatic and passionate. Within 2 months, several team members came to HR with complaints. Maria was setting aggressive targets and bluntly critiquing those who fell short. One rep was put on a performance improvement plan within 45 days of her arrival. That rep, feeling shocked and cornered, blasted an email to the entire company with the subject line, toxic alert. In it, he described the workplace as a toxic pressure cooker and accused Maria of creating a hostile environment. You can imagine the chaos that ensued. Executives freaking out about the all-staff email, employees gossiping, Maria herself feeling vilified. HR intervened, and here's what came of it. Yes, Maria's style was very direct, and perhaps she lacked some tact in feedback delivery. That was coachable. But the rep's performance truly had been subpar. Even before Maria's arrival, his numbers were low. The pit was not out of line. In fact, it outlined support and clear goals. The rep admitted in a private meeting, I just felt embarrassed and upset. I've never been on a pit before, so I guess I overreacted. Overreacted is putting it mildly. His email had used the nuclear option of labeling the whole startup toxic. Fortunately, HR and leadership handled it calmly. They addressed the team acknowledging the concerns, had Maria clarify expectations with a softer touch, and had the rep retract his email with an apology for the alarm. The lesson? One person's defensive move, using the toxic label, nearly derailed the whole team. After things cooled down, the rep actually thanked HR for not firing him on the spot for that email. He said, I realize now that being held accountable isn't a personal attack. I felt attacked in the moment, but it wasn't toxic. It was my performance that was the issue. That kind of honest reflection is rare, but really good. And Maria learned to use her feedback with a bit more empathy, preventing these flare-ups in the future. Number 2, the case of the missing meetings. At a large nonprofit, an employee, let's call her Nina, began skipping certain staff meetings regularly. These were meetings where some contentious discussions often occurred. Budget debates, strategic disagreements, nothing out of the ordinary, but they would get heated. Nina would find an excuse to be absent every time, or suddenly become busy. When a manager finally pressed her, Nina said, those meetings disrupt my peace. I consider them bad for my mental health, so I set a boundary that I won't subject myself to that negativity. On the surface, one might applaud Nina for self-care. But the problem? These meetings were important for her role, and decisions made there required her input. By avoiding them, she was forcing others to fill her in later, or worse, not getting her input at all, and then she complained about decisions being made without her. It was affecting the team's functioning. HR was consulted and had a one-on-one with Nina. They took a validating but firm approach. We understand you value a peaceful work life. It's true. Those meetings can get tense. Let's talk about why and how we can improve them. But outright avoiding all conflict is not feasible in most jobs, and it's actually hindering your team's work. Nina eventually admitted she had high anxiety in confrontational settings due to a bad past experience with a bullying boss elsewhere. This was a breakthrough. Her boundary wasn't just laziness or disdain, It came from a place of fear. So the solution was twofold. The organization agreed to some meeting facilitation training to make the forum more civil, and Nina agreed to seek therapy through the company's EAP, the Employee Assistance Program, to work on her anxiety. They also arranged for her to have a buddy in the meetings, someone she trusted who could help debrief with her afterward to ensure she felt heard. Over time, Nina started attending regularly and even speaking up. In the end, protecting her peace was a sign of an underlying issue that needed addressing, not a sustainable strategy in itself. Lesson: when someone weaponizes peace or boundaries, there may be a legitimate concern, like anxiety, underneath. If you just accept the avoidance at face value, you miss the chance to solve the root problem. The burnout backfire. A large consulting firm had a senior exec, Dan, who started missing deadlines and producing low-quality work after years of high performance. His manager in HR sat down with him to express concern and ask what's going on. Dan immediately said, "I'm burned out, plain and simple. I can't handle this workload anymore." That was taken very seriously. The firm gave Dan a month of paid leave to recover and insisted he use it to rest and utilize counseling services. They also adjusted project staffing to ease his load when he returned. When Dan came back, for a short while things improved, but soon the same issues resurfaced. This time, Dan's explanation was different. He admitted, "To be honest, I'm not passionate about this work anymore. I think I've hit a wall in consulting. Burnout was part of it, but I also just don't love this job." In retrospect, the firm realized that what they thought was pure burnout was also burnout as cover for a deeper career issue. Dan ended up leaving for a career change a couple months later. The firm didn't regret giving him the time off. It was the right thing to do. But the lesson they learned was to probe a bit deeper when someone says burnout. HR now coaches his managers to have a return to work conversation that explores how can we make your work more fulfilling or manageable going forward? Not just glad you're recharged, welcome back. Because if the work itself is a mismatch, no amount of yoga or sabbaticals will fix burnout permanently. These stories highlight that the weaponization of wellness language can be both a sword and a cry for help. Sometimes it's wielded cynically to cut off accountability. Other times, it's almost a subconscious reflex masking a genuine issue. In any case, simply letting it go unquestioned is never a solution. The companies or organizations intervened with a mix of empathy and expectation setting. They didn't say, "Oh, you said toxic burnout. Sorry for bothering you. Carry on." They also didn't say, "How dare you use those words? Stop it or you're fired." They dug in. Why is this being said? What is the context? And how can we address it constructively? As HR professionals or leaders, we have to be a bit like detectives and a lot like diplomats. We gather facts. Was there actual toxic behavior? How's the workload? Any personal issues contributing? And we navigate the conversation delicately to avoid shaming the person, but also not getting stonewalled by jargon. It's a fine line. In the next section, we'll go over some strategies and guidelines for doing exactly that. Promoting a culture where wellness and accountability coexist. Strategies for compassionate accountability. We've identified the problem. Now let's talk solutions. How can HR professionals and leaders navigate conversations where phrases like toxic, burnout, or protecting my peace arise, ensuring that we honor legitimate concerns and uphold accountability? It's about creating a culture of compassionate accountability. Two words you might not see together often, but they belong together. Here are some strategies and best practices. Foster a culture of clarity. One of the best preemptive strikes against miscommunication is defining terms and expectations up front. Don't assume everyone has the same definition of psychological safety or respect. In team meetings, discuss these concepts. For instance, clarify that psychological safety means people can voice ideas without fear of ridicule, but it doesn't mean all feedback will be sugarcoated or that challenging questions are off limits. Also, make sure employees know the performance expectations clearly. When people know what's expected and what support is available, it's harder for misunderstandings to fester. Leaders can say, "We value wellness and we value results. Let's talk about how we can achieve both." As the Fast Company article noted, psychological safety and accountability must be in balance. Too much safety without accountability can lead to comfort zone stagnation, while accountability without safety leads to fear. Explicitly state that both matter. Encourage open dialogue early and often. Issues often blow up into toxic or burnout territory when they've been stewing. Encourage managers to check in with employees regularly about workload and team dynamics. If someone says, I'm stressed or I'm unhappy with X, dig deeper rather than letting it slide until it becomes an extreme claim. Create channels for feedback, whether it's anonymous, post surveys, or one on one meetings, where employees can express concerns without fear. Ironically, promoting real psychological safety where concerns can be raised constructively helps prevent the misuse of the concept as a weapon. If people trust that issues will be addressed, they're less likely to resort to dropping bombs like, this whole place is toxic, out of pent up frustration. Listen and validate, even if you suspect misuse. When someone uses wellness language in a potentially defensive way, resist the urge to dismiss it outright. Even if your gut says, oh boy, here we go again, approach it sincerely. For example, if an employee says, I feel burnt out, the response shouldn't be, no, you're not, you're just slacking. That's never helpful. Instead, ask them to help you understand. Burned out in what way? Is it physical exhaustion, feeling mentally numb, or something else? By asking, you achieve two things. You show the person you take their feelings seriously, and you encourage them to be specific. Specifics can differentiate real burnout from something else. If someone says, I think this project is toxic, you might respond, that's a strong word. Can you walk me through what's happening to make you feel that way? Often, as they articulate, it becomes clear whether it's a case of interpersonal conflict, overwork, lack of recognition, etc. Those are things you can address. Validation doesn't mean you ultimately agree with their framing, it just means you acknowledge their emotions as real. Focus on behaviors and facts. This is straight out of a therapist playbook. Encourage discussions to revolve around what happened rather than broad labels or accusations. If an employee says, my manager is toxic, guide them to describe actions. Can you give examples of what the manager did or said? This does two things. It gathers evidence if there is toxicity, and if not, it gently challenges the employee to reconsider the word choice. By grounding the conversation in observable behaviors, you take it out of the realm of personal attack or moral judgment. It's easier for all parties to talk about behaviors. In the last meeting, the manager raised his voice and interrupted me twice. Then nebulous concepts. I feel disrespected and it's toxic. It also helps in documenting issues fairly, which is crucial if something does escalate to a formal HR action. Educate on healthy communication. Sometimes people misuse wellness language simply because they lack alternative communication tools. Providing training or resources on how to have difficult conversations is important. Teach the difference between assertive communication and avoidant communication. Role play scenarios. How to express I'm overwhelmed without ghosting, or how to give feedback upwards without using the word toxic. If you equip employees with the right phrases, they might not reach out for the dramatic ones. For example, instead of saying I need to protect my peace to avoid an after hours email, an employee could be encouraged to say, I don't check email after 7 p.m., but I'll respond first thing in the morning. It's clear and accountable. Many companies now include mental health literacy in their training, which is great, but include in that the idea that mental health terms are not trump cards. They're conversation starters. Set the tone at the top. Leadership should model the blend of empathy and accountability. If a company's executives always dismiss wellness concerns, employees will either quit or start using those concerns in extreme ways because moderate expressions got ignored. Conversely, if leadership bends over backwards so far that accountability vanishes, like they never question if someone says they're stressed, just remove all demands from them indefinitely, that sets a precedent too. Leaders should share that both values coexist. We care about your well-being, and we also have a mission to accomplish. Let's find ways to support each other in both. Michael Davis from Mindshare Partners put it well. Supporting mental health and maintaining performance are not mutually exclusive. They're mutually reinforcing. A leader who openly says that sets the stage for policies that back it up. Use compassionate confrontation. When you do need to call someone out on possible misuse, do it one-on-one with compassion. For instance, a manager might say privately, I understand you needed to protect your peace by stepping away yesterday. I'm concerned though, because we missed your input on a critical issue. How can we address the underlying problem so that you can be present? I want to help you and ensure the work gets done. This signals I'm not attacking you for saying what you said, but we have to talk about the impact. Focus on the impact of their action on the team or results, rather than accusing them of faking. Maybe they truly felt they needed to step away. Fine. Acknowledge that. But work together on a plan so it doesn't keep happening unexpectedly. It could be a workload tweak, a temporary agreement, or even saying, if you feel you need to step away, please inform me and let's ensure coverage. So there's responsibility sharing. Document and follow up. If you notice a pattern of a particular individual frequently using these phrases to excuse behavior, document it. Not in a punitive, gotcha kind of way, but to have a clear record. This helps in two respects. One, it ensures you're not relying on memory or bias if you eventually need to have a serious talk or two with HR. And also, documentation can reveal patterns, even to yourself or the employee. In a follow-up meeting, you can say, I've noticed in the past 3 project crunches, you've indicated burnout and checked out early. Let's talk about that pattern. Sometimes showing the frequency can lead the person to a self-realization. I have been saying that a lot. Maybe there's something deeper I need to address. If it's a genuine situation of overwork, this also flags to you that maybe their workload is indeed too high or they need additional support or skills. Promote resources and solutions. Always come to these discussions with offers of help, as long as a person is also willing to do their part. For burnout or mental health issues, remind them of EAP counseling or suggest a mental health day off if appropriate. For conflict issues, offer mediation or coaching. For feeling toxic culture, perhaps start an initiative on team norms or have an anonymous feedback to leadership system. The idea is to demonstrate concretely that the company does care about wellness and needs the employee's cooperation to address the issue constructively. It shifts the dynamic from adversarial to collaborative problem solving. We hear you, now let's solve the problem together. Know when to draw the line. Compassion and support have to be paired with limits. If, after accommodations, coaching, and frank discussions, a person continues to abuse wellness jargons to simply not do their job or to poison the well, then you have to consider formal performance management or disciplinary steps. This is rare, but it does happen. You might encounter someone who has learned that invoking these concepts is a great way to keep people off their back, and they exploit it to the max. You still handle it carefully, of course, to avoid any legal issues. Ensure you're not retaliating for someone taking protective leave, but you don't let it paralyze the organization. In such cases, involve HR if you're a manager or legal if needed. Make sure you give documentation of behavior and all of the efforts you've made. Then have a direct conversation. We provided X adjustment due to your stated burnout, but we are still seeing Y issues. Help me understand, because at this point, we have to find a way to meet job requirements or discuss a different arrangement. Sometimes it may even lead to amicable parting if the fit is truly not there, and that's okay. Lead with empathy, close with expectations. A nice formula some managers use in tough talks. Start by expressing empathy. I know the last few weeks have been rough. I really do hear that you're feeling burned out. Then state the expectations. We still have deadlines that need to be met and customers relying on us. And then invite a plan of action. Let's figure out how we can get you feeling supported and get the work back on track. What can we each do? This framework ensures neither aspect is neglected. It's empathetic and assertive. By implementing these strategies, HR and leaders can transform what could be combative, one-sided conversations into something productive. In essence, you're de-weaponizing the language. Words like boundary and burnout and toxic stop being weapons of mass distraction and return to being signals and tools for improvement. The goal is not to make employees afraid to ever utter those words. No, we want them to speak up about well-being, but we want the substance behind the words. When someone says those things in a healthy culture, it will actually mean something concrete. I feel burnt out because I've worked 3 weekends in a row and haven't had time to recharge. Or I feel the team environment is toxic because there's a lot of back chat and personal insults. Those are actionable. That's night and day different from blanket statements used as shields. As leaders, we should also walk the talk. Model setting real boundaries. Don't send midnight emails if you say you support work-life balance. Owning up if we contribute to a toxic feeling. Leaders should admit mistakes and apologize. It sets the tone for accountability. And acknowledging when we feel burnt out and taking care of ourselves in visible, appropriate ways. When employees see leaders handle these things with integrity, they're less likely to misuse the concepts. They see that, my manager talked about being burnt out last quarter and took a week off and then made some changes to prioritize better. She didn't just throw her hands up and stop doing her job. Before we wrap up, one more expert insight to reinforce our strategy. A thought leader, Graham Winter, wrote about psychological safety being misused and emphasized creating a culture of accountable collaboration. The idea is to blend trust with ownership so that team members feel safe and responsible. He suggests leaders explicitly define what these buzzwords mean in their team context, equip people with skills to have open conversations, and reframe conflicts as opportunities to grow rather than battles to win. I couldn't agree more. It's like setting ground rules for a game. Everyone knows how to play fair and what counts as a foul. When someone steps out of bounds, pun intended, it's addressed by the rules, and no one has to chuck the whole rulebook out the window. As we close out today's episode, let's circle back to the heart of the matter and the heart of my book's philosophy: human resources for the soul. It's all about managing that inner employee, which means being kind to ourselves, yet holding ourselves accountable for the life we want to lead. In the workplace, managing humans, others are the one inside of you, carries that same dual responsibility: compassion and accountability, empathy and truth, wellness and performance. These are not opposites, they're partners. The phenomenon of weaponized wellness that we explored is really what happens when the balance tips too far in one direction or the other. Either empathy language with no personal accountability, or conversely, all demands with no empathy until people break and then have to shield themselves. The antidote is balance and clarity. We want workplaces where you can say, I need to protect my peace. And that doesn't mean so I can get away with anything, but rather, so let's find a healthier way to work, where someone can flag, I feel this is toxic, and it leads to investigation and improvement, not eye rolls. On the flip side, not witch hunts based on a single claim, where I'm burnt out is met with both a supportive hand and a plan to redistribute work in the short term, and to learn how we got there in the long term. It's worth noting, too, that language evolves. Today's buzzwords may fade, and tomorrow there'll be new ones. Underneath any lingo, the fundamental HR task remains: pay attention to your people. Listen to what they mean, not just what they say. Teach them the skills to express concerns constructively. And don't shy away from tough conversations because you fear being seen as insensitive. You can be sensitive and firm. In fact, that's often what people respect the most: a leader or colleague who acknowledges their humanity, but also calls them to their best. Compassion isn't about letting someone off the hook. It's about understanding their perspective while you hold the hook steady. For anyone who has found themselves on either side of this equation, maybe you've been the one using these phrases in frustration, or you've been on the receiving end unsure how to respond. I hope this discussion offers some clarity and tools. If you're an employee, know that it's okay to speak up about your well-being. Just strive to be specific and sincere, and be open to solutions. If you're a manager, don't dismiss what could be cries for help. Probe deeper, offer help, but also set boundaries of your own in terms of performance needs. Sometimes in HR, we joke that our jobs is just part parent, part therapist, part drill sergeant, part diplomat. On this issue, it feels especially true. We're guiding behavior like a parent, listening to feelings like a therapist, enforcing standards like a drill sergeant, and negotiating win-wins like a diplomat. It's not easy, but when it works, it's incredibly rewarding. You see people grow, relationships mend, and the company thrive as a result. One final thought to leave you with: accountability and wellness are not a zero sum. In the long run, they actually feed off each other. A healthy, well employee will perform better, and a job well done contributes to an employee's sense of purpose and well being. When we avoid accountability under the guise of wellness, we actually risk true wellness, because doing meaningful work and being part of a functional team is good for the soul. Conversely, when companies ignore wellness for the sake of short-term results, they end up with no results, because burnt out, miserable people either leave or accomplish little. So it's a packaged deal. We should all be striving for that sweet spot where expectations are clear, support is abundant, and everyone, from intern to CEO, and yes, the inner employee inside each of us, feel valued and responsible. Thank you for listening to this deep dive into weaponized wellness. I hope you found some nuggets of insight and maybe had a chuckle or two along the way. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a friend or colleague who loves storing away therapy buzzwords. Lovingly share, of course. And if you haven't yet, check out my book, Human Resources for the Soul, Managing the Human in You, for more stories and strategies on blending the heart and science of HR in work and life. It's available on Amazon. Until next time, remember, take care of your inner employee, hold them accountable, and manage your soul with as much care as you manage your role. Stay well and stay accountable. Talk to you soon.